Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we might as well begin. It's just after 4:30. It's a great pleasure to introduce on behalf of the Jamin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies, our speaker for today, Michael Barry. He's an old friend of the center. He began our lecture series a year and a half ago with a wonderful talk about Nizami, I think it was.
Attar.
Yeah, and Attar. And he's going to talk today, as you can see, about... although from the side, Alexander looks a bit like Donald Trump when he was younger. Can't be the same man, and he certainly won't conquer the world, we hope. But today's going to talk about the Alexander romance and myth. Michael has been lecturing at Princeton for some years now on medieval and modern Iranian art and culture. Not only Islamic art and culture in Iran, but also in India, Pakistan, and most especially in Afghanistan. And as I'm sure most of you know, he's a recognized international expert on a whole range of aspects of Islamic art. He's also a special consultant to the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. And he's lectured internationally. He's won a series of prizes for his work. And he's also been an outstanding humanitarian worker. I won't say any more for now. His fame precedes him, I think. And today's lecture is entitled The Persian Romance of Alexander the Great, from Greek epic to Persian myth, poetry, mysticism, and art. So, Michael.
Thank you. Well, this show, Welcome, was actually put together to be presented last summer at the invitation of the French archaeological delegation in Afghanistan to archaeologists still working in Afghanistan, or rather to save what can still be protected from fanatical forces determined to destroy absolutely every aspect of the cultural heritage of the country. But the show was also shown to Afghan audiences in their own language, and to a certain extent, Alexander the Great seems to have made an even greater impact in Afghanistan than in Iran. And the main reason for that is because generals, Greek generals, left in his garrisons in what was the Eastern Iranian world, ultimately created an independent kingdom centered very much in what is now Kabul and Bactria, Balkh, and there they ultimately were converted to Buddhism, the most extraordinary meeting of the Greek heritage of Alexander the Great and the wisdom, mysticism, art of India. They had to meet at one point, and they did meet, and that is part of Alexander's extraordinary legacy. Now, there is an ambiguity that surrounds Alexander the Great insofar as every people whom he conquered, from the Egyptians to the Jews to the Babylonians to the Indic peoples of what is now Pakistan and southeastern Afghanistan, all those people ended up by making Alexander one of their own, as if he were the true descendant of their ancient kings, as if he were a worshiper of their own notion of the divine. The only people of the Near East who continued to revile Alexander bitterly, to resent what he had done to them, were the Persians themselves, who came to call him the incarnation of the lie, Duruj, or Druj in older Persian, he who destroyed Persepolis and burned the holy scriptures preserved since Zoroaster. So pretty much Iran stood out as the one Alexander-hating region of the late antique world, whereas the Romans openly and boldly, once they had conquered Syria and Egypt, proclaimed themselves successors to Alexander. Their mission was a continuation of the mission of Alexander to Hellenize the world, and indeed a number of Roman rulers so far identified with Alexander that Julius Caesar is said to have wept before a statue of Alexander in a little Spanish market square where Julius Caesar was then a young official of the empire, and he is supposed to have wept, saying, at his age 33, he had conquered the world, and I have yet done nothing. Augustus Caesar wore Alexander's image upon his seal ring, just to mention those two Roman monarchs. The paradox is going to come when, after the Jews, the Muslims in turn, enshrining Alexander the Great's story in the 18th surat, or chapter of the Qur'an, are going to make Alexander into almost someone blessed with prophetic status. And when that happens, and Iran is conquered by the Arabs, and Iranians become Muslims, they can no longer reject Alexander, because Alexander's memory is sacralized and enshrined in the Qur'an. And then we'll see how the Iranians are going to work their way around this rehabilitation of the Alexander figure and turn him into one of the greatest world monarchs of Iranian history itself. So many lessons. And here in this opening image, we have an idea of his importance. The coin on the left is the kind of effigy of Alexander which circulated throughout the entire Near East, not only in the days of Alexander's 4th century BC empire, but also continuing into Roman imperial days, showing Alexander with a diadem and the twin ram horns of the Egyptian sun god Ammon-Ra, as if, as he claimed, he were the true son of the Egyptian sun god, which in his Greek sort of cosmopolitan manner meant that he was the child of Zeus himself, child of the sun. So Alexander's effigy, circulating on such coins throughout the Near East for almost 1,000 years, gave rise to the name by which he is known in the Qur'an, the Lord of the Twin Horns, Dhul Qarnayn. And the Qur'an even says, they shall ask thee concerning Dhul Qarnayn. They shall ask thee concerning the Lord of the Twin Horns. After that, for several centuries, Muslim scholars are going to try to wonder and try to explain what those two horns could possibly mean. And the explanation they generally retained was, he conquered the East, he conquered the West, he was the Lord of the twin horizons, they are the twin horns of the universe, of which he was master. Now, on your right, we have one of the literarily most important paintings ever executed in all Islamic history. That's a tall challenge that I just issued even to myself and to all of you. But how so? What it depicts is, at the end of the 15th century, it was done in 1484 by Master Qasim Ali in what is now the Afghan city of Herat, then the capital of a major kingdom. It shows a dream garden, a garden of paradise in which these two characters here are alive. They represent the prime minister of the kingdom of Herat, pulling the long sleeves of his kaftan over his hands in respect, in humility, as he is introduced by his spiritual master, Jami, to the ghosts of the great Persian poets of the past. Just like Dante imagines himself introduced by Virgil to the ghost of Homer and the great poets of the pagan past. It's a very parallel type of image. What it means is that the minister, Navai of Herat, who wrote in Eastern Turkish, asks his mentor, Jami, considered as the greatest Persian language poet of his day in 1484, to introduce him to Nizami, to Amir Khosrow, to Saadi, to Ferdowsi, to Sana'i, Anwari, Khobroni, and to Hassani Dehlawi. All these great poets, all associated with having written a whole Alexander romance or having dedicated major portions of their work to the Alexander figure. You can see again in a painting like this, we are in paradise. Never will you see a crescent moon pointing downward in a real sky. You only see moons like that in Persian miniatures. And they signify that the moon is, in fact, the great supreme poet. Sheikh Awli Maqam, the sheikh of supreme rank, like in Dante. Onorate l'altissimo poeta, honor the highest poet. Nizami welcomes them all in paradise. His heart is the moon, it reflects the sun. And we are too weak to look at the sun in the face, so we look upon the moon, which offers the reflection. And this is the role of the poet and seer. And the fact that all of these are authors of verses on Alexander the Great gives an idea of the extraordinary importance of the story of Alexander in what was once high Islamic civilization. So, I hate to do this, but sometimes one must, just to have an idea of the authors that we're talking about. In fact, most of our ancient sources, in fact, all of them, dealing with Alexander the Great, really wrote under the Roman Empire, whether they were Greek writing or Latin writing. The oldest, Diodorus of Sicily, about 50 BC, then Strabon, or Strabo, in about 20 AD, both wrote in Greek. Then you have Quintus Curtius, for probably middle of the 1st century AD, who's the main Latin author, and the European Western Middle Ages will mainly know their Alexander story through him. And to the right, you have a very important character, Flavius Josephus, a Jew who was witness to the crushing repression of the Palestinian insurrection by the Romans and the destruction of the temple, but was pardoned by the emperor and attached himself to the imperial house and wrote in Greek on the antiquities of the Jews, very, very favored later by Christian tradition as being the main eyewitness to the days of Christ without actually being in the gospel itself. And Flavius Josephus had more to do with turning the image of Alexander the Great into a great monotheistic champion than anybody else. It is Flavius Josephus who tells the very strange story that while Alexander was besieging Tyre in Phoenicia, he was invited to nearby Jerusalem. And when he saw the high priest coming to welcome him, he knelt before the high priest. And Parmenion, one of the generals, asked Alexander, Your Majesty, everyone prostrates before you. Why should you kneel before this priest? And Alexander is supposed to have said, I kneel not before the priest. I kneel before the God which this priest represents. And according to Josephus, Alexander was invited into the temple itself and there worshipped the true Lord. Strange story, which indicates how far the Jews, too, adopted the Alexander figure and made him consonant with the monotheistic religions, as if Alexander were such a champion of the monotheistic faith. Certainly the most psychologically penetrating of all the authors on Alexander the Great is the great Plutarch from 100 AD or so. Shakespeare certainly read most of what he knew about Alexander the Great in his Sir Thomas North translation of Plutarch. The author considered to be the most reliable on military affairs is another one of these Greek-writing Roman subjects, Arrianos, in about the first half of the 2nd century. And then just about at the very end of the 3rd century, the very end of the pagan epoch, you have Justin, who summarized an older author from the age of Augustus, who is lost now, Probus Pompeius. What makes Justin so important in cultural history, which is strange because just about nobody reads him anymore, is that the Christian church on the verge of its triumph would confuse Justin the historian with Saint Justin the martyr, so that Justin's summary of the tale of Alexander the Great receives, as it were, further monotheistic endorsement. And this will bear into the general medieval presentation of the conqueror. And finally, strangest of all, you have somebody who is obviously an Egyptian, writing at the very end of the pagan world. Some manuscripts pretended that they were written by one of Alexander's historians and companions, Callisthenes, so we call it the pseudo-Callisthenes. And pseudo-Callisthenes, Egyptian, is the one who's going to introduce into world literature the idea that Alexander was not only, in a spiritual sense, the true son of the Egyptian sun god Amun-Ra, but was in fact the secret son of the last native pharaoh of Egypt himself. So that when Alexander enters Egypt, he liberates it from the Persians and restores true Egyptian sovereignty in himself and then his Greek successors. We'll see how this has also influenced the Islamic romance. So here we have the various Muslims who are involved. Al-Iskandar Dhul Qarnayn is the general Arabic transcription of Alexandros, Lord of the Twin Horns. Then you had, sometime in the 6th century AD, a translation into Syriac of the romance from Egypt, the Pseudo-Callisthenes. And in the 7th century, you have the very important references to the twin-horned Lord in chapter 18 of the Qur'an. Once that has been accepted into Islamic civilization, you get an Arabic translation of the Egyptian romance, probably done from the Syriac. That was dated from about 800 AD. That was long lost, and it was only recovered in a miraculous way in an old house in Aragon, which was demolished in 1881, and out of a cache in the wall tumbled manuscripts that had been hidden by Spanish Muslims from the Inquisition. And among those manuscripts was our Arabic version of Pseudo-Callisthenes. That's the way we've been able to find it. Then you have the great commentator on the Qur'an and also the first great chronicler of Islamic civilization, Tabari, in about 900, who renders the story of Alexander in a way to make it appear that he is not only a monotheistic champion, but he is the true son, not of a pharaoh, but of a Persian king. And suddenly he is restored into the Persian line. Then we're going to get the great poets, Ferdowsi, Nizami, Amir Khusro, Jami, and in Turkish, Amidi and Navoi. So, Alexander's empire astonishes us, but it starts out, of course, with the Persian Empire itself, the first universal empire known to humanity, stretching all the way from India to the Aegean, and we can even consider properly that this space that we call now the Middle East includes the Greek world. The Greeks are a marginal people on the westernmost edge of the Persian Empire, but many of the most flourishing centers of Greek culture in the 6th and 5th centuries BC are along the Asia Minor coast of the Aegean which means they are part of the Persian Empire. They write about the Persian Empire, and as everyone interested in the ancient Persian Empire knows, it's practically impossible to reconstitute the history of that empire except through the two most literate peoples on its westernmost edges, the Greeks and the Jews. It's one of the paradoxes. In the early 5th century BC, what will be the kingdom of Macedonia is a tributary state to the Persian Empire. Ultimately, this little tributary state will turn into the predatory state, which will not only conquer just about all of Greece and the Balkans up to the Danube, but will extend its power and take over the Persian Empire itself. What Alexander did was essentially take over the Achaemenid Empire, and to a certain extent, he has been called, and there is truth to it, the last Achaemenid Persian king. Here we have Darius the Great, whose empire we just saw, seen from the Greek vision. There he is, sitting on his throne and surrounded by his court, and here is Darius the Great, as he probably saw himself, in any case, as represented in Persepolis. If I'm showing you Darius the Great, it's because in the medieval Persian adaptation of the Pseudo-Callisthenes romance, Alexander the Great is going to be represented as the secret son of Darius the Great. Chronologically, impossible, but what counts here is the mythology. According to the mythology, King Philip of Macedon, in tribute to the great king in Persepolis, Istach, the great Darius, Daurab, sent his own daughter, whom the poet Ferdowsi calls Aphrodite, or Nahid in Persian. She weds Darius. Darius fathers a child upon her, but Darius is dissatisfied with certain physical shortcomings or whatever. He sends her home. He divorces her. And Philip, in his shame, shelters his daughter and brings up the child as his own. Then Darius the Great has another child, Darius the Lesser, corresponding to Darius III in history, which means that in medieval Persian mythology, Alexander the Great is in fact the elder half-brother of the king of Persia, Darius III. Therefore, in a sense, it's not a conquest, it's not a usurpation, it is simply one brother asserting his right as elder over another. Here we have the entrance to the great palace of Persepolis, gateway to all nations, the Assyrian-style winged bulls, or here the great terrace where every Nowruz, every first of day of spring, the king officiated, and I'll just draw attention to the motif of the bull, the sun falling upon the bull, the lion, the sun falling upon the bull, meaning the triumph of spring, the sun over the earth. We have the various peoples of the empire, the Medes with their sort of round felt caps, much like the Qashqai still wear in Iran, and you have the Persians of Persis, Pars themselves, with their fluted cap. You have here the Bactrians from what is now northern Afghanistan, bringing tribute with their two-humped camel, the Bactrian camel. You have here the kind of treasures that Alexander will capture, like this golden staff with lapis lazuli twin lions. Lapis lazuli only comes from one place in the ancient world, northeastern Afghanistan. This is another treasure. And here, from that same treasure, now in the British Museum, you have a wonderful depiction of the king on his war chariot with the coachman and the Egyptian face of the god Bes, a sort of ugly gnome intended to terrify the enemy, and here we have the same chariot depicted probably by the great Greek painter Apelles in this Roman copy, which has survived, the great mosaic of Alexander in Pompeii, showing Alexander on this charging Darius, who turns to flee on exactly the same sort of chariot. The Persians are wearing the same kind of turban-style hood. Here is Alexander. Again, Plutarch tells us how the painter Apelles represented Alexander as the bearer of the thunderbolt. You can even see his aegis, meaning the head of the Gorgon, in the middle of his chest, also designed to terrify the enemy. And after all, Alexander's ancestors were supposed to have officially included Perseus, vanquisher of the Gorgon, himself. Plutarch, however, thought that the painting showed Alexander as too swarthy. In fact, he said Alexander hin lifkos. He was very fair, very ruddy. Here is Darius fleeing, and here you have the satraps, the great governors who were with Darius, and who included two particular characters we're going to be most interested in. Satibarzanes, the satrap of Herat, western Afghanistan, and most especially Bessus, the satrap of northern Afghanistan, Bactria. These two are going to consider their king to be so incompetent, such a coward, to have fled before Alexander, that as they are retreating before Alexander's advance, they are going to murder Darius and leave his body on the road, and themselves move into what is now the Afghan region to organize the stiffest resistance that Alexander will ever encounter. So we have these Greek images of Alexander's triumph, and here Alexander wearing the lion pelt, as also the descendant of Heracles, triumphing over a Persian on a sarcophagus carved for a Phoenician prince who became a loyal subject of Alexander. Here, the great battle between Alexander and Darius, in fact, three battles, Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, all here summarized and mythologized in a painting created in 1529 by Albrecht Altdorfer for Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor of the, well, Germany, Spain, and a lot of the New World by then. And it is an allegory of the triumph after the retreat of the Ottomans before Vienna of the Holy Roman Emperor as the new Alexander over the Persian king as if he were the Ottoman foe. So Altdorfer took his cue from a passage in Quintus Curtius, the Roman historian, describing how when the sun rose, the moon fled, the crescent moon. And this becomes an allegory for the rise of Alexander, precipitating the flight of the crescent-bearing Ottoman Turks. So here is Darius in this painting on his chariot, and you can see his troops, how Ottoman Turkish they look, whereas here is Alexander the Great, Alexander Magnus, represented as a 16th century German knight. The same battle now seen by a painter almost contemporary to Altdorfer, Behzad of Herat. And here again, the fighters are all portrayed in contemporary dress. When you look at Behzad's paintings up close, you can see that they may look very pretty from a distance, and when you blow them up, you can see that the people who are involved in these fights get very badly hurt indeed. Behzad's disciple, Sheikh Zada, in 1527, illustrated two copies of the Alexander romance for Shah Tahmasp of the Safavid Empire, which had shortly before annexed the kingdom of Herat. this 16th century looking Safavid Persian king is actually supposed to be Alexander the Great. And here, with these kinds of low turbans, as opposed to the high turbans, are the Sunni Uzbeks that Shah Tahmasp defeated in order to hold Herat, signifying that just like in the Holy Roman Empire, just so in the 15th and 16th centuries in the Persianate world, the battles between Alexander and Darius became allegories for current political events, mythologized and turned into archetypes. And I think what we see here is that Alexander is shown bearded, meaning he is the elder brother, and here is Darius, the Uzbek lord, shown young, beardless, the younger brother. Alexander Triumphant, often represented, as in this painting from 1414 done in Shiraz, represented as the ruling prince himself, in this case the aptly named Iskandar Sultan. And then you have the pathos. According to legend, when Alexander discovered Darius's body, Darius was still alive. According to the ancient historians, he was already dead. But Alexander, in the myth, talks to Darius, consoles Darius, places Darius's head on his lap, and vows to revenge Darius by bringing the two satraps who murdered him to justice. And Darius recommends to Alexander, we are brothers. We recognize now that despite all the laws, all the fibs, all the lies, we are the descendants of a single royal house. This is why, as in this 15th century painting, or in the 16th century painting by Bosch-Don Kara from Safavid Iran, or yet again in this very busy looking and already very realistic depiction by a Hindu painter, Dharam Das, for Emperor Akbar at the end of the 16th century, where you can see European influences beginning to mingle with the Iranian influences, the dying wishes of Darius expressed to Alexander become a main focus of meditation. This is a civilization where, because of the catastrophes of the 19th, 20th, and now 21st centuries, knowledge of the artistic visual expression has become so shattered, almost so forgotten, that we forget precisely that when these paintings were executed always for kings and princes to illustrate the masterpieces of Persian literature, they constituted not decoration, frivolous ornament. They constituted pictorial meditations on the meaning of the literature, which means that it is appalling that we should continue to read classical Persian literature today, ignoring the extraordinarily precious visual glosses brought to bear by the artists who were in royal pay themselves. These are art forms that are completely wedded. And what these paintings signify is the meaning of the Book of Kings. Ferdowsi's great epic is the drama of a world which is constantly torn in fratricide between fathers and sons who don't recognize each other, between brothers or half-brothers who don't recognize each other. Finally, the time will come when all humanity will be reunited under just rule. It almost happened. It almost happened when Alexander and Darius recognized one another as brothers. And Darius said to Alexander, "Succeed to my throne, you are worthy, and wed my daughter, so that our estranged lines are reunited. That is the fundamental meaning of Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, now upheld as a nationalist manifesto in modern Iran, but in 11th century Persianate civilization, much more a cosmic book, calling for the reconciliation of the human family. This theme, therefore, comes very close to another main motif of the Book of Kings. The hero Rostam, fighting for the Iranian army, slays unwittingly his own son Sohrab, who is fighting for the army of the Central Asian Turkic peoples, Turan, signifying tragedy. This is what happens when humanity fails to recognize its fundamental kinship, so that you have the motif of the threnody, the crying, the weeping, as Rostam realizes that he has slain his own son. Just so, Alexander will weep over Darius when he recognizes that he has slain his own brother. This gives poignancy to the myth. All this goes back to the mythical idea. There you've got your lion and bull. The great king Faridun, the cosmic lord in Ferdowsi's romance, is supposed to have divided the world between his three sons. Salim, ancestor of the Greeks and Romans. Iraj, in the middle, ancestor of the Iranian people. And finally, Tur, ancestor of the Turkic, Central Asian people. So that in the wars that will succeed through the ages, the tragedy is constantly repeated, as here where the Turanian lord slays his brother Iraj. This is the Shahnameh. It is the fratricide. Just a parallel, in Shakespeare's vision, in the Wars of the Roses cycle of plays, you get the idea that things became unsettled in England because Bolingbroke usurped the throne of the true king, Richard II. As a consequence, the kingdom will be cursed with civil war. There will, however, be a blessed abeyance when Henry V, the new Alexander, conquers France and seems on the verge of reconciling everybody. In fact, Shakespeare's Henry V is very closely modeled on the Alexander romance, even to such details as the French prince who sends tennis balls in mockery to Henry V, saying that's all you're fit to play with. And in the Alexander romance, it is Darius who is supposed to have sent polo balls to Alexander in Macedonia, saying this is all you're fit to play with. Ultimately, in Shakespeare's vision, you get the Henry VI plays where brothers and fathers and cousins and sons kill each other until final reconciliation of the two houses of York and Lancaster. And this is very, very similar to Ferdowsi's epic vision. Now, we're going to try to reach through the myth to the real Alexander, and we'll see how troublesome it is. You probably have all heard of the story of the young Alexander at his father King Philip's court and his taming of this terrible stallion Bucephalus, the ox-head horse. A horse that was actually rearing and prancing because afraid of its own shadow. And Alexander taunted his father and said, "If I can ride and tame him, will you give him to me?" And Philip said, "Of course," never realizing that Alexander had seen that the horse was afraid of its own shadow. He turned it towards the sun and bound it up on its back and rode it to the applause of the Greek, or rather Macedonian court. So this is supposed to be, and Plutarch is the only one who tells this story, a kind of foreshadowing of Alexander's greatness. Is this an ancient representation Well, the horse is very beautifully handled, like an ancient horse, even to the way the mane is clipped, but in fact, it is a little masterpiece by the Italian Renaissance artist Benvenuto Cellini. Here we do have an ancient effigy of Alexander that seems to have been found in near Aphrodisias in what is today Turkey. Or here, another bust of Alexander, also found in what is today Turkey, and all showing that characteristic which Plutarch said the sculptors from Lysippus onward tried to reproduce, a kind of sideways tilt of the head and a melting glance which Greek and then Roman rulers are going to try to imitate. It's the Alexander look, like in this coin, which was issued actually in the 3rd century AD by the Roman Emperor Alexander Severus, showing that glance, that liquid glance that Plutarch speaks of, as if Alexander were looking up towards his father, the sun god himself, the sky god. Here we have Alexander's father from the same series issued in the 3rd century, very realistically done. There you get Philip of Macedon, the conqueror of most of Greece, the one who was planning to attack the Persian Empire until prevented by death and succeeded by Alexander. And we get the great shift in fashion. Philip's hair bound by the fillet or diadem of royalty, Philip with the full beard, and Alexander, as you can see, clean shaven. Why clean shaven? Why this major shift in fashion, which was going to last for centuries and seems to have inaugurated the idea, very recurrent in Western European civilization, that gentlemen should shave their beards. Apparently, it has a lot to do with Alexander's wish to represent the divine in man on the cusp between adolescence and manhood, the Apollo look, which is before the beard. Full athletic body, but clean shaven. Whereas Philip represented the older, full bearded generation, where the ideal of manhood is associated with the bearded Zeus. Here we have a true portrait of Philip with a spent eye, and Alexander's mother from the 3rd century AD issue, Queen Olympias. Queen Olympias of, how do you know how to pronounce it in English? Epirus, was supposed to have been something of a magician, even a kind of a witch. You know, she liked to handle snakes and invoke all sorts of sorcerers. And according to Plutarch, she was in bed with a serpent when Philip was spying through a chink in the door, and a thunderclap tore the sky apart. Just at the same time, the great temple of Artemis in Ephesus was destroyed by a pyromaniac. And Philip, on seeing this thunder and lightning descend upon Olympias's belly, was even lost sight of one eye, according to legend, returned to his chamber and had a dream that his wife's belly had received the seal of a lion head upon her navel, thereby giving rise to the idea that Alexander was not really his son, but the son of a god, whom he then would raise as his own. In the Pseudo-Callisthenes Greco-Egyptian legend, it is the last pharaoh, Nectanebo, who, overthrown by the Persians, has found refuge in the court of Macedonia, seduces the queen by telling her that she will see in a dream the Egyptian god Amun-Ra with the twin horns himself, and she will carry his child. He puts her to sleep through his magic and his sorcery, and of course he slips into her sheets, and it is he who is the true father of Alexander. So all these stories were current. This very interesting fresco was found just in the 1980s in Macedonia, at Vergina from Alexander's time really shows these divine prototypes with a Philip-looking god, well, Hades, Pluto, carrying off Proserpina, Persephone, and he's the one who's bearded, and in front runs Hermes, very much like the beardless Alexander. Here again is the most famous bust of Alexander, associated, probably this is a Roman copy, with the great sculptor Lysippus himself. The great adversary, first to Philip, then to Alexander. Demosthenes, the champion of Athenian democracy. Restricted, elite, aristocratic, slave-owning, male-centered, to be sure, but still the idea that the political center of civilized life must be a small city where all voters know each other, called the polis, P-O-L-I-S. When Philip first and Alexander then crushes the rebellion of Thebes and Athens and Corinth, he brings about, Alexander, something new, which the Greek language is going to call, from Alexander's time on, cosmopolis. The world is my city. Demosthenes, the great orator, will eventually take poison 1 year after Alexander's death in a futile attempt and ending in defeat to revolt against Macedonian rule. So we have these philosophical associations, which are most important to the romance. Alexander received the education of a prince with Aristotle himself as his tutor on the left, and Alexander will carry to battle with him all the way to India the copies of the Iliad and the Odyssey edited by his master Aristotle. And yet Plutarch tells us that Alexander did not listen to Aristotle's advice to treat Greeks as a leader, hegemon, but to treat barbarians, meaning Persians and anybody else, as a slave owner, as a despot, despotikos, as if they're all slaves. No, Alexander instead, or so Plutarch tells us, will insist, Greek and Persian, all people have one fatherland, one patria, and this is the cosmopolis, the one world. This vision is very much associated in Greek philosophy with the character on the right, Diogenes. Now, in this carving, which really is 17th century, was done for Louis XIV of France by Pierre Puget, we see the legend of Alexander and Diogenes, which is going to become a main ingredient of the Persian myths. This is that when Alexander conquered revolted Corinth, which you see in the background, he was told by the Corinthians that a certain man living just outside the city in an old tub, in a dry wine jar or oil jar, with no other possessions except his rags and a dog on a leash. Why a dog? Because it gives us the Greek word cynic, meaning dog-like, cynical. Diogenes had renounced all wealth. Therefore, Diogenes was free, the way no one else in Corinth was free. Diogenes would wander through the streets of Corinth by broad daylight at noon with a lantern. And people would say, why with a lit lantern? And he answered, I'm looking for a true human being. And who is that? One who is free. So when Alexander rides up to Diogenes with his troops and officers and says, watch, I'm going to raise a question with Diogenes. Diogenes, I am Alexander. What do you want me to do for you? And Diogenes says, get out of my sunlight. Alexander tells his astonished officers, if I were not Alexander, I should wish to be Diogenes. Diogenes because the representative of a new kind of character in what will be the despotic empires of late Hellenism and then Roman and ultimately Islamic times. They're all military dictatorships. However, the one person who can tell the ruler what the ruler is doing wrong, who can admonish the ruler, and who is protected by society, is the naked hermit who has renounced all wealth, so that you have the dichotomy between the poorest and the richest individuals in the kingdom. This story is told to us by Plutarch, by Diodorus, by Arrian. All of these Greeks tell us this story in connection with Alexander's meeting in India with the yogis. And it is the Greeks who tell us. This reminds us of Alexander's earlier meeting with Diogenes. It is the first hint we have of what actually became the cross-fertilization of Hellenic and Indian civilization. These three heads of Alexander, in a sense, summarize the geography of the character. Yes, in the middle we have Alexander as Lord of Egypt. So we have the twin ram horns. On the left, Alexander with the lion pelt, descendant of Heracles on his human father's side, Philip, so the European. And then on the right, the conqueror of India, Asia, with the elephant pelt. Now, first we're going to look at Alexander's conquest of the western part of the Persian Empire, and we have to be reminded that the Persian hold on Phoenicia and Egypt was actually very tenuous by the 4th century. Artaxerxes III had only just recovered Egypt in 341 and forced the Phoenicians and the people of the island of Cyprus once again to recognize the supremacy of the Persian great king, but the Persian rule was still very shaky just when Alexander forces his way into it. The strategy of Alexander, as was very made clear by the Greek historians themselves, was after the first knockout blows at the Granicus and at Issus, first conquer the entire coast before dealing with the Iranian heartland, to deny the Persians harbors and the Phoenician sailors by which to mount a counterattack against the Greek homeland itself. So this explains the strategy. Alexander is going to capture Tyre after a tremendous 7-month siege. According to legend, visits Jerusalem. Then in Egypt, he will travel. Again, I'm sorry for the filming here, but he is going to travel beyond Alexandria, which he founds, all the way to an oasis in the western desert, Siwa, the oracle of Ammon, the Egyptian sun god, one of the holiest shrines in all Egypt, and which was also extremely familiar to the Greeks. You had Greek colonies at Cyrene, and even the Greeks in the homeland would send gifts to the great shrine of Ammon and assume, the Greek way, that Ammon is just an Egyptian way of saying Zeus. And in Siwa, this journey through the desert, there Alexander will be saluted like a successor to Pharaoh and will be called by the high priest Pelios, O son of God, whereupon Alexander will be depicted with the ram horns of an Egyptian sun god. This journey is about as far west as Alexander will ever get. However, in myth, the Greeks and Romans already assumed that if Alexander had been able to, if he had lived, he would have carried his conquests as far as Italy and Spain. In the medieval Islamic romances, he does. And in any case, this journey through the desert is going to become an allegory of the journey of the soul through the wasteland of this lower world as far as the Atlantic. This becomes the great western part of the Alexander romance. So first, the conquest of Tyre, with siege engines here depicted in an Assyrian relief, but they hadn't changed much by the time of Alexander, to capture this great stronghold, to deny the Phoenician navy to the Persian Empire. Then here the Phoenicians as tributaries to the Persians and a Phoenician ship. And here we have already an indication how before Alexander himself, the mingling of Greek and Near Eastern cultures had very much begun. This is the god of the Phoenicians, called at Tyre Melqart, meaning Lord of the city, but called by the Greeks Herakles, and represented already in this Cypriot Phoenician carving as a combination of the Lord who quells the lion, and therefore as Heracles with the lion pelt. And Alexander dreams that Heracles appeared to him, held out his hand to him, and promised him the city. And the Phoenicians in Tyre, in their dream, according to Plutarch, were so afraid that Heracles would betray them that they tied down his image with chains and nailed the feet to the bases to make sure that their god would not desert them. But he did, and Tyre fell to Alexander. And here is when we have the supposed episode of Alexander's visit to the Temple of Jerusalem, as here sort of reconstituted by 20th century Israeli archaeologists, and here a 16th century depiction of the medieval Islamic transformation of the journey of Alexander to Jerusalem, which becomes the journey of Alexander to the Kaaba in Mecca itself. The real journey, of course, is to the oasis of Siwa in Egypt, and we're very fortunate to have this fresco from Vergina showing a young horseman very much like that clean-shaven or yet beardless Alexander look. The image of the Egyptian sun god Amun-Ra from very late pharaonic art, or here Pharaoh crowned with a combination of the mitre of Osiris and the twin horns of the ram, the sun god. To the crocodile-headed god he offers worship. And here, sorry, did I have that? Yes. Here we have Alexander's name, Alexandros, in hieroglyphs, and here an early Hellenistic Egyptian representation of the Greek king with the ram horns. There, in much more traditional style, we actually have in Luxor Alexander the Great himself offering worship to the Egyptian god Min, and I think you can all tell that he represents fertility. And this is Alexander's supposed Egyptian father, Nectanebo. So Alexander is now adopted into the line of Egyptian kings. He has liberated Egypt from Persian rule. So Alexander's successor in Egypt, his general Ptolemy, is shown here crowned as a pharaoh by the goddess of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, combined crown. Then we get Alexander's greatest realization, the city of Alexandria, and on an island called Pharos, the construction of what seems to be, in fame in any case, the world's first lighthouse. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, thus reconstituted by Jean-Yves Lempereur, the main French archaeologist who's found a lot of remains of it in Alexandria Harbor over the last decade. And here we have the only representation surviving from the ancient world of the Lighthouse of Alexandria, which was topped with a statue of Heracles. It's on a glass bottle from probably the 2nd century AD, and guess where it was found? At Bagram, which is now the main American air base in eastern Afghanistan. That's where it ended up. Now, what's interesting about the Lighthouse of Alexandria, for those of you with any Arabic or Persian, looking at this last depiction from somebody who saw it in the 12th century before it was overthrown by an earthquake, a Venetian mosaic, St. Mark, and the Lighthouse of Alexandria. And on the right, we see the Islamic inspiration. The Lighthouse of Alexandria became the prototype of the Islamic minaret. And you all know how you say minaret in Arabic and Persian. Lighthouse, minar. That is what it comes from. And here we know that the Romans actually built a replica at Cadiz on the straits between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, which in medieval Islamic times, until it also collapsed in an earthquake in the 12th century, was regarded as having been built by Alexander. It had a statue of Heracles, and this is a sketch done by Abu Hamid of Granada in the 12th century before its collapse, and it says, Hadith Sanam Qadis alladhi banahu dhul qarnayn, the story of the idol at Cadiz, which was built by the twin-horned Lord, by Alexander the Great. وَذَلِكَ فِي الْأَنْدَلُسِ مَجْمَعُ الْبَحْرَيْنِ. And this is in Spain, the Andalus, at the mingling of the twin oceans. The Quranic rendition of the story of Moses reaching a mysterious place where twin oceans or twin waters mingled becomes, in the medieval Alexander romance, the meeting of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. And there is another great lighthouse with the Heracles figure atop it. Now, visions in the Alexander romance of the great lighthouse of Alexandria go way beyond the time when it was actually still standing, like this 16th century Ottoman miniature on the left, or on the right, an Indian one, which is very late 16th century Indian, is you can see that the lighthouse is supposed to keep watch against pirates, and these pirates now are already armed with muskets. But what you see at the top of the lighthouse is a mirror. And here we have, by two great Hindu artists working for Emperor Akbar, Nanha and Shivdas, Shivdas being servant of Shiva, you have the story told by Nizami that Alexander the Great, for his lighthouse, actually created the world's first mirror. We don't know when he lived, it was so long ago. People had no mirrors, but Alexander, wielding his sword, saw his face in his blade and realized we must make a mirror. And it will be a mirror in the Lighthouse of Alexandria, which will allow any ruler to be able to see any enemy, however far he is. The creation of the mirror is actually going to be explained mystically by Nizami in this romance to signify the ruler's heart must be a spotless mirror. If the ruler's heart is pure, then he can look into his heart and he will see the seven climes of the world. Just so, the great Persian kings had a magic cup which served as such a mirror. The mirror of Alexander and the cup of Jamshid are equivalent symbols, and they signify the purity of the ruler's mind and heart. If he does not have a pure heart, if he is a tyrant, if he sins, then his mirror will cloud over. So one of the greatest romances of Alexander, written in India in the early 14th century in Persian by Amir Khosrow, is called precisely that, Aynaye Sekandari, the mirror of Alexander. Now we'll go back east and follow the Vergina frescoes and attack for the knockout blow, which will yield Alexander mastery of the eastern half of the Achaemenid Empire. We have, from Vergina's archaeological finds, wonderful representations of the kind of helmets of the Macedonian officers. We have reconstitutions of the formation of the phalanx with the long sarissa, spear. We have from Vergina frescoes of a Macedonian officer on horseback, no stirrups yet, charging down a Persian infantryman, more flatteringly depicted in the art of 5th century BC Susa, the immortals, the 10,000 guards of the king, who were constantly replaced and rotated so that there were always a number of 10,000, whatever the casualties. And Alexander, after defeating Darius for the third and decisive time at Gaugamela in northern Iraq, enters Babylon, one of the great cities of the empire. Fortunately, the great gate of Ishtar, through which he rode, is preserved in Berlin now. Alexander rode into the city, not on horseback, but archaic style, on a chariot, just as in this coin by his father Philip, representing Apollo. He is an Apollonian figure. He is the sun god, riding in triumph into Babylon, one of the greatest cities of the world, as the new Apollo. This is what he sees in Babylon, the wonderful tiled bricks, the lion and the dragon, equivalent symbols for the guardian figure. And in Susa, now in Iran proper, the Iranian adaptations of these Babylonian prototypes, like the twin guardians, and between them, Ahura Mazda himself, the god of sun and light, as an Egyptian winged disk rising above these Assyrian-style guardian figures. Persepolis, where Xerxes is represented slaying a dragon, which is what a good king is supposed to do symbolically, and yet Persepolis, which is now Alexander's own property, in a drunken banquet, apparently egged to do so by a courtesan, Thais. He seizes a torch and sets fire to the great palace. Flames over Persepolis. This is what's going to be regarded by Iranian tradition from the 4th century BC, 330 BC, until Islamization as the sacrilege. This is where Alexander burned the sacred texts of the Avesta themselves. In fact, and this is something that amuses archaeologists, when Alexander and his troops set fire to the palace, there was a storeroom which held clay tablets with all sorts of boring records on the price of oil and tax registers and things of the sort, which the Achaemenids had not bothered to fire in ovens because that was very expensive. It used up fuel. So this kind of records is just like scrap paper. So all this was just left on unbaked clay. And the fire of Persepolis baked the entire Achaemenid records in Persepolis and preserved them for posterity. So it's one of the strange things that can happen that can console us to some extent to the way human beings simply love to destroy things. We're going to move east. Darius is dead, and now Bessus, satrap of Bactria, and looking very much like these characters from the eastern part of the Iranian world, has proclaimed himself the new Achaemenid king, Artaxerxes, Artaxerxes the fourth. And Alexander, like this Macedonian officer, ride now to confront what will be the most serious resistance they will have to face in this region. So we'll be able to follow how he moves into Herat. What's very characteristic of all Iranian history is how this huge desert, the great Dasht-i Kadir, in this area here, separates the eastern Iranian world from the western one They are mainly connected by a line of oases to the north, which is the main road. Whatever king can hold both wings is a great king. Darius or Shah Abbas. Most kings cannot hold both sides, and they go their separate ways. And they become today Iran and Afghanistan. Not quite an accident. In Herat itself, this is the kind of terrain he faces now. In Herat itself, one of Alexander's generals, Erigios, in what looks like a tale of knighthood from Quintus Curtius, encounters the other great satrap, Satibarzanes, in single combat in front of both armies. Erigios on horseback, no stirrups. Lance, Satibarzanes on horseback, no stirrups. Lance. They charge at each other like knights, and Erigios rams his spear right into the throat of Satibarzanes, who, feeling himself dying and realizing that his Greek opponent is still too far for his own lance to reach, helps the Greek's lance into his own throat so he can move forward and barely touch Erigios before dying. Right out of Quintus Curtius. I don't know how you feel about it, John, but every time I read a Roman historian, I think these people spend a lot of their entertainment watching gladiator games. Here's another miracle. Again, we have, look at these two sculptures. Sculpture on the left was found in Pompeii. Sculpture on the right, also representing Alexander, was found at Bagram in Afghanistan, just to give you an idea of the spread of his empire and his influence. Alexander, and in northern Afghanistan, Alexander is going to fall in love, according to the historians, for the very first time. After having vanquished Bessus and ordered him crucified or other nasty ways of putting people to death described by the various historians, Alexander now wants to consolidate his empire, and he must attract the support of the great Iranian nobles. And at a feast given in Balkh, Bactra, modern Balkh, northern Afghanistan, he falls in love with the daughter of his host, who has a nice Persian name, Roshanak, Roxane, meaning the shining one. Oh, sorry. He falls in love with her, and you could ask me, he's going to marry her, and then he's going to order his Macedonian officers to take Central Asian and Persian wives to bring together a fraternization of both peoples, like a prefiguration of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. Do we have representations of this from ancient times? And the answer is yes, because as a matter of fact, the ancient view of Alexander wedding Roshanak was mythologized archetypically as Achilles, also supposed to be one of the ancestors of Alexander, with his Trojan love, Briseis. And if you look carefully at this Pompeii Roman reproduction of what is probably a Hellenistic original, we can see that Achilles looks very much like Alexander himself. It's the same sort of fashionable look, the tilt of the head, the melting glance. Alexander even had one of his tutors along, Lysimachus the Elder, whom he playfully would call Phoenix, after the name of Achilles' tutor. He reenacts Achilles, and Quintus Curtius and Plutarch both say Alexander and Roshanak is Achilles and Briseis. Or here, even more so, at the Olympic Games in the 3rd century AD, according to Lucian, the painter who won the contest for art represented the wedding of Alexander and Roshanak as the wedding of Mars and Venus, Ares and Aphrodite, to the details which are actually reproduced in all these Pompeii paintings. It's obviously a cliche motif. The little cupids now play with the armor discarded by the war god. And you again see that General Alexander the Great, Hellenistic young warlord look. This is why Botticelli adapted the motif in one of his most famous paintings, Mars, Venus, or, if you like, Roshanak and Alexander and the little satyrs playing in the armor. Or here, the story is so rich, where here we have Veronese's rendition of the other important woman in the historical Alexander's life. The historical, not the mythical. The historical. Alexander is going to spare, with great generosity, this is a 16th century vision, the women of Darius's household, the queen mother, Darius's wife, and Darius's daughter, Statira. And in fact, he will wed her also. In the simplification of myth, Alexander's wedding of these two women, Roxana, daughter of a magnate, and then Statira, daughter of the Persian king, will become fused into a single all-purpose figure, so that in the medieval romances, actually, Alexander simply weds the daughter of Darius, and it is represented this way with the very young Alexander in this early 17th century erotic painting, Roshanak, now considered to be the daughter of Darius himself, and a very puzzled Aristotle, looking like an old mullah, very puzzled. Alexander isn't supposed to be doing this sort of thing. He's supposed to treat Persians as subjects, not as equals. In fact, here's the detail. In fact, the romances already beginning in Hellenistic times are going to attribute a third love to Alexander. Alexander encountered the nomadic peoples of Central Asia, whom the Greeks call the Scythians, Scythi, the Persians, the Saka, hence Sakastana or Seistan today. He will encounter these people, and one of their chieftains is going to give or suggest that Alexander marry one of his daughters when they submit. And in the legend, this is going to become Alexander encountering the Amazons. Plutarch has a wonderful passage where the Greek historian Onesicritus, at the court of one of Alexander's successors, Lysimachus, is writing about Alexander's encounter with the Amazons, the warrior women, and Lysimachus just says with a smile, "And where was I when all that was happening?" The legend signifies that Alexander is also a new Theseus, as in this depiction. He carries away, here he is younger with his friend here on the right, but that is the Theseus, young warrior, carrying away the Amazon queen, whom he will wed. In the Pseudo-Callisthenes romance, this becomes Alexander's encounter with the queen of Ethiopia, Candace, Kandaki, whence Arabic Kandaka, and ultimate Persian corruption, Kaizafe, which is what she's called in the Shahnameh. But here, when Nizami handles the story, in his early 13th century romance, as magnificently portrayed by the master Mirza Ali in the early 16th century, we have Alexander encountering the great queen of the Amazons in Nizami's own home country, Barda, Azerbaijan. And she is depicted as a queen of Sheba. She is all wise. She is all noble. Alexander has heard of her tremendous reputation, so he first decides to visit her as his own ambassador, posing as his own ambassador, but she has recognized who he is because she has collected paintings representing all the kings of the world, so she knows that this is Alexander himself. And she teaches Alexander a lesson. She invites him to a great feast, and the feast is platters of gems. And Alexander says, "These are beautiful gems, Your Majesty, but one cannot eat them." And she says, "Of course not. And what are you going to do with all those treasures that you are amassing?" And Alexander is smitten with love and weds her. This is Nizami's own touch, characteristic of his poetry. It is always women who initiate their menfolk to a higher level of wisdom. Nizami himself compares them to Khosrow and Shirin, and the painter Mirza Ali makes clear that the parallel is to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, the holy couple. We can stop when you wish, because we can carry on to his death. It's nearly, okay, so maybe it's, the whole tradition is so extraordinarily rich. I just wanted to show you Alexandria Aria, which is Herat today. You can still see the Greek town plan, the Hippodamian plan, and the great mosque is now built exactly at the crossroads. And into the 14th century, Herati Persian language chronicles praise Alexander and his design of the city as a sarib-e morabba, a cruciform square. This is the world as Alexander the Great thought it looked. It's a transcription of the map of Eratosthenes. Basically, he is convinced that surrounding the world is the river ocean, and his hope is to reach the extremity of India and reach the ocean on this side, then perhaps be able to sail around all the way to the straits that we now call Gibraltar. The Greeks also thought that a single mountain chain extended from the Taurus, the Elborz, the Hindu Kush, the Himalayas, and they were absolutely convinced that these were all sections of a mountain chain which they called the Caucasus. In Greek, this section of the mountains was called Indikos Kafkasos, if you'll allow that pronunciation, meaning the Indian Caucasus. That's the origin of the word Hindu Kush, which doesn't mean Hindu killer and folk, as in folk etymology. It is derived from the Alexandrian geographers. Then, this is upside down for you, so I'll put it right side up. In the medieval Islamic romances, as in this Al-Idrisi map from the 12th century, reproduced in the early 15th, this is the world that Alexander explores. You can see a very strange looking Europe. You can see Africa rounded out this way. And Alexander is perceived as reaching the ocean, and then he sails across and he reaches this mountain chain. This mountain chain on the outer rim of the earth is what medieval mythology calls sacred Mount Qaf. Every one of these mountains, the Indian Caucasus, is a link between earth and heaven. Every one of them is Mount Purgatory. If you are saved from shipwreck, which otherwise signifies damnation, and you can reach one of these mountains, and if you can make your way to the top of the mountain, you will be saved. That is the story of Dante's Ulysses, who is damned. Alexander, in the myths, is going to reach these mountains and touch the threshold of heaven. This is the origin of Mount Qaf. Those of you who might like to read the Arabian Nights might consider that all those strange adventures that Sinbad has occur in the land of magic, which is the chain of mountains around the world. We've been able to take Alexander so far.